Hey there, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we bring you a chilling collection of horror stories set against the soothing sound of rain. Before we dive into suspense, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. If these stories send shivers down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear slowly take over, and tell us if you enjoy this kind of storytelling. Now sit back and relax, we're about to begin. I received an urgent call around midnight on June 17, 2018. Working as a mine rescue specialist based in Denver, I was used to emergency calls, but this one felt different from the start. Typically when I get called out, there's clear information: trapped miners, a structural collapse, or equipment recovery with a defined timetable. This time, the details were suspiciously vague. My first impression suggested something catastrophic had occurred. The call came without warning in the dead of night, with mentions of a significant geological event, but no specifics. The person on the other end deflected my questions with a stream of "I don't know"s. I recognized most rescue coordinators across the state, but these people were unfamiliar, expressionless, official-looking strangers. They drove me for hours to a remote location in the Colorado Rockies. Picture this isolated mountain road suddenly crowded with official vehicles. I noted representatives from the Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Geological Survey, Colorado Department of Natural Resources, and the EPA. At least half the vehicles had no markings at all, and some had clearly fake identifications. One even claimed to be from a flower delivery service. I was hurried through a crowd of agitated officials. Some shouted into phones, others argued heatedly among themselves. One red-faced man in his 50s was practically screaming at a young woman who just kept nodding with a plastic smile. People bombarded me with questions. How soon can you get ready? Did you bring your own equipment? Where's your clearance form? Two familiar faces appeared in the crowd: Mark Jenkins, who had just celebrated his 41st birthday last month, and Diana Coleman. I'd worked with Diana on several mine collapses, but nothing remotely like this situation. I spotted a few vaguely familiar faces, but Mark and Diana stood out clearly. They were already checking their equipment and preparing for whatever awaited us. Someone thrust papers into my hands. As I signed, I noticed a tight cluster of officials surrounding a representative from the Bureau of Land Management and an older woman in an expensive charcoal pantsuit. "You have 10 hours, the pantsuit woman declared firmly. "Not a minute more. This is private property." Mark waved me over, and I sat beside him on a rock as I began checking my gear. "Someone needs to tell me what's happening," I demanded. "What exactly are we dealing with?" "Landslide," Diana replied. "Not massive, but significant. How does a landslide warrant all this?" I gestured at the circus around us. "It's the mine," Mark explained. "You'll understand when you see it." Still adjusting my equipment, we were hustled forward through the crowd. Officials pulled at my arm, peppering me with questions as we walked. When we finally emerged from a dense stand of pines, I saw what once had been the entrance to an old mining operation. The scene was chaos. The landslide had collapsed part of the mountainside, revealing a previously sealed tunnel system. Workers in hazmat suits were taking readings around the entrance, while others secured the perimeter with warning tape and markers. Around the newly exposed opening was a jumble of scientific equipment, laptops, and monitoring devices. A stern-faced woman appeared beside us, urging us forward. Dawn was approaching, the sky beginning to lighten behind the mountain peaks. "We need a blind exploration," she stated. "Maintain constant communication about everything you encounter." "You're going in within 30 minutes. That's not happening," Mark protested. "There's no emergency here requiring." Without warning, the woman shoved Mark, sending him stumbling backward. "You are doing this," she hissed. "You're doing this now. We're not moving until we get proper. You see all those vehicles," she interrupted, pointing to the army of official cars. "That represents federal authority to ruin your career. You do this or you'll never work in rescue operations again." Diana helped Mark regain his balance, and we hurried toward the mine entrance. The area bustled with activity as technicians set up more equipment. Two men attempted to brief us, but they clearly knew little about what we were entering. The only concrete information they provided was about the size of the cavern system we would be exploring. The landslide had uncovered an extensive network of tunnels, approximately 300 feet wide and 600 feet deep, all underground. I struggled to comprehend the scale. We tested our linked communication systems and agreed on individual safety lines. We'd explore for 25 minutes, then allow 20 minutes for a safe return. Oxygen tanks would be monitored constantly, and we'd maintain continuous contact with the surface team. At the first sign of trouble, we'd abort, no questions asked. We'd also agreed to return immediately if communications failed, though we all knew standard hand signals. There was no room for error. We were still finalizing preparations when they handed us collection tools and sealed sample bags. "We want samples of everything," they instructed. Everything you find. To put this in perspective, we knew almost nothing. A landslide had exposed a previously unknown tunnel system on what appeared to be corporate property. The sheer size and depth were staggering. In 10 hours, we'd be forced off the site, likely so they could bring in their own people. This cave system had been sealed off, perhaps for thousands of years. A researcher kept mentioning pre-glacial formations, though that seemed improbable. Whatever was down there would either be scientifically priceless or entirely worthless. We were about 2 hours into the countdown when we first approached the entrance. The air flowing out was much colder than expected. As I adjusted my headlamp, one of the technicians double-checked my oxygen supply. "This must be exciting," he grinned. "I'm jealous. Why's that?" I asked. "You're about to see something no human has ever laid eyes on. That's not always a good thing," Diana remarked. "There's a reason some places remain unexplored." We entered the tunnel. Visibility was poor due to dust and debris, so we proceeded cautiously. The temperature dropped with every yard, and floating particles in our headlamp beams made it feel like driving through a heavy snowstorm. As we descended, an uneasiness settled in my chest. I'd never been so poorly prepared for an exploration, and this was unlike anything in my experience. There's a reason experienced rescue workers avoid unknown tunnel systems. This was quite literally uncharted territory. We descended about 30 feet before reaching a solid floor. The tunnel walls were rough and jagged, covered with some kind of crystalline deposit. Possibly mineral salts, I guessed. Diana collected a sample as voices crackled intermittently in our earpieces. "Go deeper," a voice ordered. "There's nothing interesting at your current position." We mapped 3 different passages leading further down. The first was too narrow, our equipment would have caught on the walls. We backed out and tried another until finding one wide enough for comfortable movement, though it still required crawling rather than walking. "Team Alpha were reading seismic activity," a voice announced. "Please respond, stand by, adjusting position," I replied. I felt the camera on my shoulder whir as it adjusted. Mark spoke through our private channel. "Mostly limestone and quartz. This is pointless, we'll resurface in 10, I said. "Check the rock formations for samples before we go." The tunnel opened into a small chamber about 18 by 15 feet, with a ceiling barely 7 feet high. It was enough space to regroup, check our lines, and collect samples. Diana discovered some transparent residue along a crack in the wall, while Mark chipped at a limestone formation. I noticed something glinting and discovered a quartz crystal, which I collected. When our time expired, we returned to the surface methodically. We couldn't possibly reach the bottom depths in 10 hours, but we hoped to gather enough significant samples. Upon surfacing, at least 50 people crowded around us. Men in hazmat suits collected our samples in coolers, while technicians prepared extended air supply systems. We took a brief break while they worked, changed our oxygen tanks, and planned our second descent. This time we could go deeper. The new air system could reach 90 feet, but technicians were already working on extending it further. Still, Mark insisted on keeping our backup tanks refreshed just in case. As we connected to the air system, the stale oxygen from our tanks was replaced by the sharp mountain air, carrying hints of pine and disturbed earth. There was also a faint odor of diesel from the generators powering the equipment. We descended again, heading straight for the tunnels. This time we pushed deeper, beyond the dust and debris. We mapped 3 more passages going steadily downward, moving carefully with our new air lines serving as additional tethers. Soon we reached the system's limit. Diana reported back. Surface control, we need extended lines, no response. We waited a moment but heard nothing. By now, the sun had likely risen fully outside. As Mark had predicted, we'd gone too deep for reliable communication. I can go back up and relay the message, Mark offered. Or we could tug on the lines and hope they understand. I'm not tugging on air hoses, Diana laughed. This is bad enough, you hearing this? I asked as static burst through our comms. You getting that? Diana's voice broke up. I think the cameras on our shoulders began spinning wildly. Diana signaled for us to surface and took point position. Mark and I followed. It was time to abort. A deep rumbling sound emanated from below us. It felt like the mountain itself was shifting, pulses of vibration that made the walls crack. Something significant was happening, and we needed to evacuate immediately. I felt my breathing quicken as my body sensed danger. The moment Diana entered the first tunnel, I saw the rock wall move. Solid limestone shifted with alarming ease. With a thunderous roar, the tunnel collapsed above us. The air lines snapped and Diana's leg was crushed in an instant. The hoses released compressed air that mixed with blood in a horrifying spray as the sound of our collapsing world became deafening. Fragments of Diana's screams came through our comms as the ground beneath us gave way. We were being pulled downward. I protected my head as the current tossed me through tunnel after tunnel. My oxygen tank banged against the walls. I gasped instinctively but felt nothing. The air supply was completely cut off. Rock walls rushed past as I slammed against them. My shoulder, my knee, my hip, my back. At one point, I struck the back of my head hard enough to cause an immediate temperature change in my body. The wound wasn't deep, but it was blighting. During the chaos, the camera tore off my shoulder, and I began to tumble uncontrollably, losing all sense of direction. This wasn't just momentary. The falling and tumbling continued for what felt like minutes. I could feel blood leaving my body, and the cold intensified. I couldn't tell if the chill came from blood loss or the environment. Disoriented doesn't begin to describe my state. Then suddenly everything stopped. I floated in complete darkness. A black, bottomless void. I couldn't distinguish up from down anymore. I tried to swim upward, but something felt wrong. My arm wouldn't respond correctly, and the resistance felt backward. It took several seconds to realize I was trying to swim downward. I was completely inverted. Water had seeped into my mask. I could feel it pooling below my mouth. Small air bubbles formed as I exhaled, and I had to spit to keep my airway clear. The liquid had a strange metallic taste mixed with something sweeter. Most of it was my own blood. Something grabbed me. My instinct was to fight, but I couldn't. My arm was injured and my right ankle was dislocated. I was shivering uncontrollably and could see a long gash across my thigh at the edge of my headlamp's beam. I couldn't even see my feet beyond that. Mark's face appeared in front of me. He made a hand gesture I didn't immediately recognize, a closed fist with fingers pushing outward. An exhale. I understood and exhaled forcefully, clearing the moisture from my mask. The next moment, Mark connected my backup tank to my mask. For a moment, we just stared at each other. He had a deep cut above his left eye that was bleeding into his mask. Our communications were dead, so we relied on hand signals. Mark touched my face and checked my mask for cracks. It seemed intact. He signaled okay, and I responded affirmatively. I wasn't okay, but I was functional enough to move, albeit slowly. We proceeded cautiously. There was no way to determine our depth, and we needed to conserve oxygen. At most, we had about 50 minutes of air if we remained calm. Probably much less. Mark and I held hands, slowly ascending what we hoped was the correct direction. It felt right. I was properly oriented now. We continued upward, but it seemed like we weren't making progress. The darkness remained absolute, with nothing changing around us. Then Mark suddenly stopped moving. I positioned myself beside him and followed his gaze upward. Small flickering movements disturbed the darkness. A school of strange, pale creatures about 5 inches long with a bluish tint. They had no visible eyes, their faces covered with strange, tentacle-like appendages around circular mouths. They avoided us carefully, darting away at impressive speed. They stayed close enough that Mark could have touched them if he wanted. Neither of us did. Whatever these creatures were, they had evolved in this isolated environment. They could be toxic or dangerous. Mark tightened his grip on my hand, and we continued upward. After about 10 minutes of moving in a straight line, we came to a complete stop. A solid rock ceiling blocked our path, just a flat wall without any openings or tunnels. It occurred to me that we might have descended through a side passage. If that was true, we were like flies hitting a window, futilely trying to escape in the wrong direction. We scanned the area, but the ceiling appeared almost perfectly flat. There was no obvious exit route. Still, I forced myself to remain calm. Panicking would only deplete our oxygen faster. Yet despite the seemingly vast space around us, I'd never felt so trapped in my life. I held my breath, trying to control my shivering. Mark reached for his collection tool. Striking the ceiling, he dislodged a few fragments of rock. He watched them carefully, looking for any movement. Beyond sinking, they drifted slightly to our right. Of course, there was a current. I was simultaneously trying to ignore how much time had passed and counting every second. Mark's diving watch had been damaged, and mine hadn't been properly reset before our second descent. It still showed the time from our first exploration. This was exactly the kind of oversight I'd wanted to avoid, but we'd been rushed back in. Eventually, the ceiling began to curve, and there finally was an opening. It seemed to light upward. We followed it, squeezing through a tight space where I had to exhale completely to pass. Inching forward breathlessly, feeling tons of unstable rock pressing against my aching chest. Then we broke through to an air pocket. It wasn't the surface, just a bubble of air large enough for both of us if we crouched. A tunnel continued further, but we paused to catch our breath. I was the first to turn off my air supply and clear my mask, with Mark quickly following suit. Finally, we could speak again. Stale, metallic-tasting air filled our lungs. I coughed, making my ribs throb painfully. The landslide, gasped Mark. It wasn't finished settling. When the temperature changed with sunrise, it shifted again. How deep are we? I managed. At least 250 feet. Straight down. When that's just the vertical drop, Diana. Did you see if no? Mark shook his head. The tunnel sealed. She might be trapped up there, but at least she won't suffocate. I nodded, gently examining my ankle. I needed to reset it, but even light pressure sent shooting pain up my leg. You could wait, he said, noticing my pain. You're injured. I'm not dying down here. Good. We rested briefly and checked our equipment. We had about 2/3 of our tanks remaining, which was promising. We had numerous cuts and bruises, some potentially requiring stitches. Nothing immediately life-threatening, but infections were a concern in this unknown environment. I couldn't stop shivering, and Mark kept asking if I felt drowsy. Truthfully, I did. My eyelids grew increasingly heavy as my lungs strained against my bruised ribs. We returned to the flooded section, our equipment secured. The tunnels gradually widened, allowing us to crawl forward. We encountered several intersections and mapped our route carefully. I had scraps of reflective tape from my damaged equipment that we pressed into cracks in the walls, marking our path like breadcrumbs. At minimum, we could return to the air pocket if necessary. We explored several tunnels only to encounter dead ends. The system was a labyrinth, and my heart sank with each blockage. When we finally found a promising path, we faced a difficult choice: return to regroup or continue forward to save time. Every minute spent backtracking was wasted, but every minute pushing ahead could be fatal. Mark squeezed my hand, seeking guidance. I signaled forward. The tunnel opened into a vertical shaft rising straight up. I felt a gentle flow of water pushing us back. It was subtle, but made me realize the current was strengthening. Suddenly, the water around us came alive with movement. Dozens of those strange blue-white creatures rushed past us, fleeing deeper into the tunnels. Perhaps they were following the current. Regardless, they had to come from somewhere, so we continued upward. Mark squeezed my hand in encouragement. Another set of tunnels branched from the ceiling, all appearing wide enough to be viable routes. We selected one at random. I couldn't leave any more markers. I had nothing left. We continued climbing until Mark abruptly stopped. Something was glinting in the tunnel ahead. Some kind of mineral deposit catching our headlamps. Another dead end. Warm eyes. Reflective predatory orbs. Unfailing and ancient. A creature incapable of seeing me as human. In that moment, I was merely potential food. It emerged from the darkness, long, bone-white limbs like an emaciated spider monkey, with needle-sharp teeth designed to strip flesh. It didn't swim, it crawled along the rocky walls with terrifying speed. Fast enough to hunt the small blue creatures. It was large but moved with shocking agility. It barely fit through the tunnel, while Mark and I had room to maneuver. We were never meant to encounter this thing. Never. To this day, I can't look down dark hallways without imagining those limbs reaching for me. I abandoned every safety protocol I'd ever learned. I rushed, gasped, screamed. I crawled, kicked, and forced myself downward as fast as humanly possible. The searing pain in my ankle became irrelevant. All that mattered was escape. I could feel the water churning behind me as my frantic movements created turbulence. But I didn't care. At that moment, survival was my only concern. At the tunnel mouth, I glanced back for an instant, only to see Mark's wide, terrified eyes. In that moment, I knew what he was thinking. He realized he was about to die. Long fingers wrapped around him as his left arm was torn from its socket. The vibrations of his death screams reached me, but all I heard was my own panicked breathing. I remember flashes of pale blue creatures as I fled through tunnel after tunnel. I didn't see a single marker. Every movement sent waves of pain through my injured ankle, and tears streamed from my eyes, irritating the skin around my mask. I passed another air pocket but kept moving. I had no idea where I was, but I could sense those glinting eyes searching for me, limbs reaching. The air in my tank began feeling strange, warm, and stale. Panicked, I continued forward. When I finally found another air pocket, I tore off my mask and shut off the tank. Everything tasted of blood and minerals, and I couldn't stop sobbing. The space was barely large enough for my head if I tilted it correctly. My headlamp flickered weakly. If I held it at the right angle, it worked, but it was clearly failing. I remained there for at least 10 minutes, just trying to breathe. I was lost, injured, and freezing. There was no way to know how long I'd been underground. I couldn't even tell how much oxygen remained in my tank, but it wasn't much. If I wanted to move, I needed to ration it. But I couldn't move without it. What were the chances of finding another air pocket within a minute of free diving? Yet I couldn't stay. I didn't trust anyone on the surface to mount a proper rescue. Even if they wanted to, could they? Without the creature hunting me, I would still eventually freeze or bleed to death. Wait, bleeding. My pulse quickened as I sensed the change in pressure. Something moved in the tunnel below. There was no way I could escape quickly enough. I could only hope it wouldn't find me. Maybe it didn't track prey like a shark. I held my breath and felt disturbing movements in the water. Whatever it was approaching. I squeezed my eyes shut so tightly my head spun. Tears leaked out, creating small ripples as they hit the water surface. The sounds were barely audible, but to me they seemed thunderous. The movement stopped. It was close. I carefully opened my eyes to look down, but everything was black. My headlamp had died completely. Moments later, the movements continued past me. Perhaps it wasn't accustomed to hunting humans, or maybe it was returning to its nest with Mark's remains. When I could no longer feel the disturbances, I exhaled violently, coughing blood. I had no options left. I had to continue with what little resources remained. I secured my mask and let my hands float in the water momentarily. Drifting in that tiny space created a sensation unlike anything I'd experienced before. It was alien and primal. I'd faced danger before, but nothing remotely like this. Nothing that made me feel so completely helpless. I slowed my breathing and submerged again. Surprisingly, without light, my sensitivity to the current increased dramatically. Perhaps it was my other senses compensating, but the flow direction became clearer. Even in absolute darkness, I could feel which way to go, circulation coming from above. At a junction, it became harder to determine the correct path. I decided to keep moving upward whenever possible. The current grew stronger, and suddenly I emerged into another air pocket. I heard something, a metallic clanking. I found the source quickly, Mark's oxygen tank. On one hand, I was incredibly fortunate. On the other, that creature was nearby, too close. I still had a small reserve in my tank, so I continued forward. This air pocket was expansive, more like a chamber. Shallow water forced me to walk and bear my full weight. I'd never felt so heavy, and my equipment only added to the burden. I was exhausted. It would have been easy to lie down and surrender to whatever came first, death or sleep. Instead, I pushed forward with the extra tank. I continued upward, holding my breath as long as possible, using precious oxygen only when absolutely necessary. I felt more of those strange creatures rushing past, sometimes in my direction, sometimes away. I realized they might be fleeing a predator, and I'd been foolish not to follow them. Then again, they might simply be following currents. There was no way to know. I must have navigated through caves, passages, and tunnels for hours, using every air pocket I could find, eventually abandoning my depleted tank. All I had left were the remnants in Mark's tank. Each foot of progress felt like a death sentence, as if I were digging my own grave. Maybe if we'd remained at our original position, someone would have found us. Perhaps taking action had been the wrong choice. I was ascending when the air in Mark's tank began to fail. When I surfaced in yet another air pocket, I discarded it in frustration. This was it. The end. The tank clanged against the cave wall, and from somewhere deeper in I heard a noise, a soft gasp. Something had heard me. I pressed myself against the wall as I heard large, wet feet slapping against stone. The creature made strange, frog-like breathing sounds, air pushing through a membrane. I stood at a painful angle, supporting myself entirely on my good foot. The creature stopped and listened. Blood dripping from my arm created soft ripples in the water. Fortunately, it didn't notice me. Instead, I heard a bone snap like a brittle branch. Then came sounds of gnawing and eager feeding. I must have stood frozen for at least 30 minutes. Eventually, I heard it move down a side tunnel and disappear into the depths. This was my chance. I limped away only to step on something, a partially devoured human limb. From that point on, I proceeded systematically. Hold my breath for 30 seconds, follow the current. If I couldn't feel a path forward, I'd return, catch my breath, and try another route. I was holding my breath so long that my chest hurt more than my ankle. Still, I was making progress. Finally, I reached a large vertical shaft. I felt a strong current flowing upward. This had to lead somewhere. I held my breath as long as possible, waiting for an air pocket or the surface. But this time there was nothing, just a dead end. I slammed into a smooth surface, hitting my head. Part of me wanted to scream in despair, forcing precious air from my lungs. A cramp seized my leg. Pain rippled through my body. But the surface was smooth, unnaturally so. Almost metallic. I pounded it with my fist. It was thin but solid. Definitely metal. With each impact, I sensed movement below. Something was rising from the depths. It had found me. It began with a gentle touch against my good leg, delicate fingers wrapping around my ankle, ready to pull me down. I refused to surrender. I kicked, crawled, pushed upward, and hammered the metal barrier. A cramp in my arm forced me to release air. Something grabbed me from below, dragging me down several feet before I broke free. Gathering momentum, I launched myself upward, crashing into the metal surface again. This time it gave way. Just slightly, but enough. Suddenly there was light. There, whatever reached for me recoiled in terror. 4 men had removed what appeared to be a makeshift hatch cover, and they pulled me to safety. I barely registered that I was breathing. I just filled my lungs with air so I could keep screaming. And screaming, and screaming. As it turned out, Diana had reached the surface. She'd lost her leg below the knee, but she'd survived. She'd been airlifted out, and the entrance was temporarily sealed. They'd attempted to assemble another rescue team, but no qualified personnel were available nearby. With more time, they would have flown specialists from Seattle. I had been underground for 8 hours and 42 minutes. I was required to sign a non-disclosure agreement lasting 7 years. That period has now expired, which is why I'm sharing what happened. Mark died in those tunnels, and Diana was permanently disabled. While I consider myself fortunate by comparison, I didn't emerge unscathed. I won't detail everything, but some wounds aren't as visible as a missing limb. The site was purchased by a corporation called Apex Mining. I'm certain they continue operations there today. I've seen the security fences, warning signs, and armed guards. I've since abandoned my rescue career. I can barely enter caves for recreational purposes anymore. And honestly, I'm at peace with that. Thank you for listening till the end. I hope you were able to relax and will now get a good rest. And don't worry, new stories are already on the way for tomorrow. So don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to stay connected. Now have a good night. See you in the next episode.